Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Welcome to the National Endowment for Democracy. My name is Wilson Lee. I'm the Senior Program Officer here for Asia, and I oversee the Pakistan portfolio. We're very happy today to host all our distinguished guests, two of whom came from Karachi, and I think the first plane out of Karachi, so we're very happy they made it out in one piece. A little bit about the endowment. We are a grant-making organization. We've been operating for 30 years now, and we have a pretty significant program in Pakistan, more than 30 grants, and among the, I think, 32 grants that we're supporting at the moment, the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy, is the largest grant. And then I think we're entering our 10th year of support for their work, and we're very eager to hear more about what they've been doing and their assessment of the situation in Pakistan. I think just a brief introduction in DC. I think many analysts here focus on security issues for the most part, and economic issues sort of fall to the wayside. But in terms of democracy and regional security, I think the issue of economic reform and economic policy is an extremely important one. Especially reorienting the Pakistani state from a national security state to more of a trade, investment, and economic growth-oriented state. So these questions that we are exploring today will have, I think, profound implications for democracy, delivers, and I think also for the regional stability as well in Afghanistan, and also we recently had the election of Modi in India. So I think there are a lot of very interesting questions that we can discuss in the question and answer period later on. But right now I'll just hand it over to Mark Schleifer of Center for International Private Enterprise.
Thank you very much, Wilson, and thank you very much to the NED for giving us the opportunity to host this discussion today. Your conference space is much nicer and more expansive than ours over at SIPE, so it's really good to have this opportunity to pull folks together for an important discussion about events in Pakistan. I won't take long as sort of the moderator. Really, it's my job to just sort of kick us off and hand it over to our distinguished panelists. I'll just say a few quick remarks. Also, we are filming this, so I would assume that means we are on the record. And also, we're encouraging folks, if you're interested, to tweet about any of the discussion today. And I'm informed that we should use the hashtag @NedEvents. Sorry, not @NedEvents. Hashtag NedEvents. I'm still learning Twitter. As Wilson noted, I think that this is obviously an important time, and it's sort of a milestone for those of us who observe events in Pakistan. As the regional director at SIPE for South Asia and Eurasia, I actually only recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, began following events in South Asia. So for me, it's been a very steep learning curve. My background prior to that was mostly on Russia issues. I think, as someone who was sort of new to the game, I think that I shared a lot of the optimism that was sort of generally prevalent in Washington last May, when the PPP government became the first democratically elected government in Pakistan's history to serve out its full term and hand over power to a successor government, to PMLN, through an election process that was largely deemed free and fair and transparent. And I think that one of the things that we'd like to look at in this session today is how has that optimism sort of borne out over the past year? Where are we now? I think because SIPE looks at the issues at the intersection of market development and democratic development, one thing that we obviously track quite closely and that Moin will make some remarks on is how we view PMLN's delivery on a very robust economic agenda, a very broad set of promises that they came into office promising to do in terms of revitalizing the economy. But I think also today we're going to explore some of the broader issues around the democratic trends. I think also we unfortunately are coming together after quite a difficult week for Pakistan. After the arrest in London of the MQM leader, the riots in Karachi were followed by the horrific attack on Jinnah Airport in Karachi. So, once again, the world's attention has been focused on Pakistan and not in a positive way. Wilson and I were just chatting before we started about some of the parallels with 1999, and one of the things that I might ask all the panelists to comment on is the extent to which the democratic trends have been consolidating over the past year, and maybe if we could sort of get some insight as to whether the policy of negotiations that has been pursued by Sharif and also sort of the policy of negotiation is sort of the main kind of, I would say, foundation of the main opposition party of PTI at this point, whether that policy is going to be something that can be sustained in the long run given current security challenges. So that's my sort of brief intro. With no further ado, let me very briefly introduce our panelists and then ask them each to make about 10 to 15 minutes of remarks each, and then we'll open it up to discussion. I think that we have the room booked for 2 hours, but we'll sort of see how discussion goes. If you all sort of can comment for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Starting on the far right, we're very pleased to have with us today Esperanza Gomez-Jalalian. She is the president of the U.S.-Pakistan Business Council at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where she previously served as the executive director of the U.S. PBC since 2003. Sorry. The U.S. PBC seeks to advance U.S. commercial interests in Pakistan, working closely with a wide range of chamber member companies, business and government leaders, and American chambers of commerce abroad, including the AmCham in Pakistan. And I should also point out that SIPE, our organization, was originally created as an affiliate, and we are an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce within the NED family of institutions. Next to SB, we have Brian Vogt. He is Senior Democracy and Governance Advisor at the Office of Afghanistan-Pakistan Affairs at USAID. He's also a Truman Project Fellow and the co-leader of Truman's Asia Expert Group. He has over 13 years of experience in international development and political advocacy, and recently served as program manager for Asia at NDI, the National Democratic Institute, which is, as most of you probably know, also another one of the NED core institutes. Then we have, next to Brian, we have Moin Fuda, who I'm very pleased to welcome here to Washington. He is based in Karachi, where he is SIPE's country director, basically runs all of our operations in Pakistan and has done since we opened our office there, coming up soon on 10 years. Prior to joining SIPE, he served as the managing director of the Karachi Stock Exchange, and he is an expert on economic and corporate governance issues. He has an extensive background of service both with chambers of commerce and also in the private sector in Pakistan. And then finally, Dr. Ehtisham Ahmed is visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics at the Asia Research Center. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn. He has held senior positions over the past 2 decades at the IMF, was a member of the core team in the World Bank for the 1990 World Development Report on Poverty. So I'm very glad to welcome all of our panelists, and perhaps we can start. Should we start from right to left or left to right, or how do you prefer? We did not discuss the order of operations. Sure, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I wanted to talk about a little bit was the intersection of economics, the constitution, and politics in Pakistan, I think in keeping with the questions that you very nicely posed. I think people have been, as you said, congratulating themselves on the political handover of power from one elected government to another. And of course, this is clearly an important step, but this is an important step more in terms of the form of electoral politics rather than the reality. And I think here the distinction between form and reality is quite important. Now, I'll elaborate on that as we go along. I think the problem, at least in my mind, is that if the electorate, which was, of course, quite disappointed in the performance of the last government, sees the electoral process as musical chairs amongst amongst dynastic elites, which was indeed the case during the 1990s. Although the mechanism of going from one government to another was tended to be through dismissal by either the president, including presidents of their own parties. So it was a considerable amount of dissatisfaction with the performance of the two main parties in the 1990s. So the question really is whether, sort of a democratic process that tends to generate little hope for, shall we say, improvements in the lives of the majority of the population, whether that might essentially lead to a backlash. And a backlash against democracy, and it's a backlash which allows undemocratic elements to gain influence, and we're seeing quite a few evidence. We're seeing some evidence of that in Karachi, Fata, some evidence also in the Punjab. So if you find that the benefits of growth or the benefits of what is seen as largesse don't trickle through to the population, and if you have then a sense that there is capture by the elites and growing disparities, then you may have a problem. And I think the problem in the Pakistan case is partly institutional and partly political. And I think the core of this is the problems in financing. And it's financing the political process. How do you finance parties? And that, I think, is a question that really has not been properly asked in our political dialogue. How are the parties financed? And, of course, very closely linked to that is the perilous state of the Pakistan public finances, and that's the state finances. And I think the important thing to realize is that these two go together. And these really play on what I see as weaknesses in the Constitution. And the weaknesses in the Constitution are not new, but really go back to the really the founder of the Constitution, the Founding Act, which is the Government of India Act of 1935. The 1973 Constitution is pretty much a copy of the 1935 Government of India Act, and that act was essentially a colonial act, which was essentially to divide and rule. And the way that the British saw that was to have overlapping assignments, both in terms of spending responsibilities and in terms of revenue generation. Now, of course, if you have, and that indeed is very much the heart of the constitutions, both in India and Pakistan. In Pakistan, the 18th Amendment has tried to undo the overlapping of the spending assignments in the hope, I think, that this might lead to it being more difficult for the military to take over. Whereas in India, the focus has been how do you fix the revenue side. And I'll talk a little bit about both these issues. And I think looking at the debates in India, they realize that the split assignments on, particularly for the GST, pose a problem. They pose a problem because they add to the cost of doing business. And India has great power pretensions and wants to compete with China. And anything that adds to the cost of doing business, they want to fix. And there was a commission of, it was called the Empowered Commission of State Chief Ministers, has been working for the last several years, and had come up with the proposal for a constitutional amendment to fix this overlapping responsibility on the general sales tax and create also a national tax administration serving the states and the central government. That debate has not taken place in Pakistan. If anything, we have gone in the opposite direction. And the imbalance in the discussion between the constitution, which is the unraveling on the spending side, and continuing the imbalance and the split assignments on the revenue side, makes it really a very, very fragile economic basis. The problem is that you can fix these things if you realize there is a problem. And unfortunately, both parties have disregarded this issue, even though the PPP government in the 2008 program had committed to fixing the problem in return for $11 billion from the IMF and $7.5 billion in Kerry Lugar money. They had no intention of doing so. And that I want to touch on. So let's start with the financing of political parties. There really is no mechanism. And what we have in Pakistan is a, shall I say, a nascent political process, or not really matured yet. So if you spend long periods in the wilderness, punctuated by military rule, and you have a dynastic tradition, the Bhuttos or now the Sharifs, and essentially you're relying on people and powerful groups to finance your next election campaign. That's what it's all been about, I think, since the resumption of the democratic process following the death of Zia-ul-Haq. How do you finance elections? And this is a perennial issue. And each government, is, whether it was PPP and the Benazir Bhutto or Nawaz Sharif, Mark 1 and 2, or Zardari and then Mark Nawaz Sharif, I don't know, it's still Mark 1 and 2, I think, by the looks of it. There is not much sign of Mark 3 yet. Essentially are looking for financing from wealthy sources. And of course, for the PPP, it's the landed aristocracy and the large industrial groups. PMLN relies much more on the small traders, plus the agriculturists. So I think there is a similarity in the sources of finance. They go to the same people, and the same people essentially extract favors. So essentially what you have are favors which are granted as a result of deals done for financing. And of course, then you have vote buying through some of the spending programs like the Benazir Income Support Program, which was $500 million for the re-election of Mr. Zardari. But then, Mr. Nawaz Sharif thinks it's a great idea, changes the name and continues with it. So in a sense, you have emphasis on some vote buying, but really not a coherent economic strategy. And the other, of course, the quid pro quo for industrial favors is essentially tax exemptions. They're afraid of people, essentially a ruthless tax administration, don't want to be caught in the clutches of essentially extortive income tax officials, and for that reason are also very happy to get SRO exemptions, sometimes by name, for both the income tax and the general sales tax, as well as for customs duties. So what you have as a result of all of that is a Swiss cheese of a tax system, which neither generates revenues. I mean, at 8.5% of GDP, Pakistan's tax collection is probably one of the worst in the world, nor does it generate information. And I'll come back to the information issue because that's really the key. What you want is a tax system that, particularly from the general sales tax, that generates information that you can use for the income tax. And we have a situation where there's no information being generated and no interest in generating the information either. As I said, the Government of India Act of 1935, coming now to the weaknesses in the Constitution and how that's reflected in the financing side. It was divide and rule for the colonial government and was quite useful for successive military governments also. And of course also on the other side of the border, as we know, Indira Gandhi also used these provisions to impose an emergency. The 18th Amendment was really designed by both parties. It was the PPP and the PMLN together to try and remove the overlapping assignments on the spending side to make it much more difficult for the military ever to take over. That was the main reason they were doing it, not to improve service delivery. And I think this is a point that people have not actually focused on. So really, and in doing so, they also then reversed many good things which had been done under Musharraf. Not that I'm a fan of Musharraf, but he did do some good things. And one of the good things he had done was to allow the Federal Bureau of Revenue to collect the sales tax for both the provinces and the Federation. That was undone in the 7th NFC and the 18th Amendment. So really, the 7th NFC made the GST unworkable. No country in the world puts a GST on services at the subnational level. The Indians have it the other way around, and it's still a problem. Turning it the way it's been done in Pakistan, really following on from the 1973 Constitution, where services were defined as haircuts. In 1973, there was no GST in any, well, apart from France. There was no conception of what it might look like. So Bhutto didn't do a service. And of course, remember that the resumption or the assumption of the sales tax on goods in 1947 was a change that Pakistan had done to the Government of India Act 1935 on independence. And that was done because the Federation had no money. So they grabbed what they could, and that also created a problem with the East, because essentially you took away the revenues for the provinces and gave them nothing in return. So that's a big problem that goes back to some of the difficulties that Pakistan has faced right through its history. Both PPP and PMLN have used the discretionary powers in the tax, overlapping tax powers to essentially make friends and influence people. And what that has done is to create a huge imbalance between expectations and reality. So the expectations in 2008 were that the tax reform, which had been promised to the IMF, would take a tax GDP ratio of 10% to 15% at the end of the program, which was 2 years ago. And that hasn't happened. Instead of going from 10% to 15%, it's gone from 10% to 8.5%. At the same time, the 7th NFC promised more resources to the provinces because the provinces are responsible for delivering basic services, education, healthcare. and Pakistan was not fulfilling basic service delivery at the provincial level. So they said, we'll give you more money. We want spending on health and education to go up to around 6% of GDP. If you get, say, 57%, 58%, or 15% of GDP, that's another 2.5 to 3% of GDP in terms of revenues to the provinces. That was promised in the NFC. That hasn't happened because 57% of 15% is quite different from 57% of 8.5% of GDP. So in a sense, the expectation of the gap between the provinces' responsibilities pre-18th Amendment is 3.5% of GDP. And then you dismantle the overlapping responsibilities and give everything to the provinces. Well, how are they going to finance them? They're not. So in a sense, what we have created is a monster giving responsibilities to the provinces and no financing. So what do you do under these circumstances? So in a sense, what has happened is extremely dangerous because the split GST is being used by some provinces, particularly Sindh, to create distortions in interprovincial trade. So if you're importing through Karachi, heck, you're going to be paying a duty if you are in Punjab or KP, because everything is going through Sindh, and they're charging something called a service tax on everything that's imported. It's their right. That's what they gave them in the 7th NFC. But that's essentially creating tax wars between the provinces. And at the same time, your tax GDP has continued to tank, and there's a big gap. Now, what has the Federation done in terms of filling the gap? Well, the IMF has come in and said, well, we have to fill this gap. How are we going to fill this gap? Well, provinces are going to run a surplus. My goodness, which means they're going to spend even less than the 2008 levels on education and health. So not only are you not giving them the additional money for health and education, but you're holding back the levels of spending that, and this is in order to meet IMF targets. This is ridiculous. So you're basically squeezing the provinces in order to meet macro targets. And what do the provinces do? Well, they stop paying their electricity dues. And before you know it, circular debt is back. They just don't pay. So you don't pay us, we don't pay you. So in a sense, what you now have is a tax war, or a spending war, or a resource allocation war between the provinces and the Federation. Because the provinces, because the governments in power, successive governments in power, need the special favors of their friends and relatives with money to finance their next electioneering campaign. That's why you have a tax system that looks like Swiss cheese, doesn't generate revenues. They're not interested in taxing direct incomes because they're friends and relatives, of course. I mean, what do you want to do that for? So really, the incentive for every level of government is to run arrears and borrow. So the federal government is borrowing as if there's no tomorrow. With the help of the IMF, they go up and borrow $8 billion, $2 billion at 8%, 800 basis points, probably the most expensive sovereign loan in the world today. How are you going to pay it back? Okay, you've got money coming in today. You sell the family silver, that's fine, but then, you're still stuck at 8.5% of GDP. Oh, they said we're going to remove SROs. Well, you know what that means, of course, and we'll do it gradually. We'll remove the SROs for our enemies. So in a sense, what they're doing and what the IMF is encouraging, rather than a blanket removal, which would be a fair way to go about it, you do it selectively. Well, you're just increasing the gameplay. Keep your friends happy, punish your enemies. So that's essentially the gameplay that's going on, and my friends in the IMF don't seem to see it. So in a sense, what you have is a distortionary financing to very short-term nature. You're running the country on hock. It's on borrowed money. It's borrowed money. It's borrowed time. It's a continued failure of service delivery. And you're fanning the flames of resentment. Just have to look at what's happening in Karachi, Punjab, AP. You're handing the country to the Taliban on a platter. So that's the result of the failure of public policy. Since what you have is a failure of governance and a failure of public policy. And unfortunately, what are you getting out of it? Well, you're getting some good projects which might be worthwhile, but who needs a bullet train from Karachi, from Rawalpindi to the mountain resorts, for heaven's sakes? What on earth are you smoking these days, Mr. Nawaz? So really, the provinces are retaliating. They're not paying their bills. And that's, you don't pay us, we don't pay you. And it's come in the last 1 year, all the circular debt had been removed. The first thing they did was paying off the circular debt. It's back. So how are you going to solve that problem? I don't see it happening. So really, the question to ask, and here we're amongst foreign donors, and we are in the midst, hopefully, of some industrialists. What is it that you guys can do? Well, I think the key issue is to highlight that if you want a vibrant private sector to survive in this country, you need a level playing field. You do not want the tax system to essentially create impediments to trade. Now, if you have a GST which is full of holes because you're not paying income tax, what it does is you're adding a cascading element in the price of goods so that when you export, that tax component remains. So what India is trying to do is remove it. And that's why you need the integration of the GST. So if you have a properly integrated GST, all the tax on inputs is taken out when you export the goods. Then you can compete with the Chinese. But what has Pakistan done? Well, firstly, they've appreciated the rupee. So you've lost all the benefits of the preferences that were given by the European Union. And then you end up creating these cascading distortions. So you're basically cutting your own feet. That's what we're doing. So there's really no recognition of this. It's really shocking that there's such a big debate in India on the importance of removing these tax distortion on export, and on the Pakistan side, nothing. It's as if this is the God-given right that we must have SROs and special provisions and exemptions and an unworkable structure of the revenue assignments. Going back to the Government of India Act 1935, making it worse. So what have we done? We've made Government of India Act worse, unimplementable. So really, there's a constitutional problem. It was fine to get rid of some of the overlaps, but then what do you do with higher education? What do you do with healthcare when you have epidemics? Provinces can't handle it. You end up creating barriers to trade. You're destroying the economic common market. That's what we've ended up on the spending side. On the revenue side, it's unworkable. You can't finance spending. So in a sense, what we've done is to dig a hole for ourselves and not seeing it. What can foreign investors do? Press for a level playing field. You want us to come and invest, you want us to come and export, fix your GST. GST is friendly for investment because it's taken out when you export. Not the sort of broken GST that cascades and leads to cost escalation. And of course, you also need a proper corporate income tax, and you need a proper income tax so that you have less of a feeling that this country is run by the elites for the elites. So you need some equity. You need to make sure that there is some ownership, that there is services are being delivered efficiently. The tax system is playing a proper redistributive role. Without that, I'm afraid what we're seeing in Karachi is only a taste of what's to come. The consequences of getting it wrong are very severe. I don't have to underline that. Getting it wrong in Pakistan will be much more damaging than getting it wrong in neighboring countries. So I think that was the argument used by successive governments, support us, or this country will go to the dogs or to the Taliban. Heck, but then, you have breathing space, use it. Use the money, use the investments. Fix your tax system. Be seen to be fair. Be seen to be providing public services efficiently, not excluding the poor. You can provide public services to the private sector, by the private sector, that excludes the poor. So make sure you provide public services to the poor. And that's not easy, but it must be done, or, the slide will continue. I'm sorry, it's a bit pessimistic, but unfortunately, to solve this, you must have a realization there is a problem. I don't see that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ahmad, for that very sobering, I think, assessment of some of the current economic challenges. I'm certain that when SB makes her remarks, she'll probably speak to some of the things that her member companies are doing to push for a level playing field for the foreign investment side. But perhaps we could turn it over to you now, Moin, and you can talk a little bit about what the domestic business community is doing in Pakistan to look at some of these issues that were raised.
Wilson, regular visitor to Pakistan, Mark Schleifer, Jennifer, and may I also recognize Mr. Shuja Nawaz. When I came here, everybody started asking, did you leave before the attack or after the attack? But to me, the attack was painful, mainly because it got many lives lost, but more importantly, it was the Uzbeks who launched the attack, and about 10 of Uzbeks. So Karachi is now, we were discussing last night also, that the Uzbeks are all over in labor. We used to have Pathans from Peshawar, but now we have Uzbeks, and we saw that Uzbeks have launched this attack. It's quite painful, and it's worrying for people in Karachi. And with these Taliban, different factors of Taliban, different groups, now they will have to obviously find their way to generate resources to launch their operation, and we are worried in Karachi with regards to the kidnap and ransom and other motives to collect the funds. So this is a big issue for this government, Nawaz Sharif's government, I think. When we were talking, or we were hearing about the two prime ministers getting together last month, and similarities between the two prime ministers, the biggest challenge before the Nawaz Sharif is to deal with these Taliban. Different views. Imran Khan favors talks with Taliban. Within the PMLN, you find Shahbaz Sharif, who is the Chief Minister of Punjab, and a couple of others. They also favor talks with Taliban. Not because they love Taliban or they would like some deal to be struck, but mainly because they are all scared of the attacks that they could launch. And Shahbaz Sharif, more important, is scared because he wants to bring foreign investment into Punjab in the energy sector and all other areas. And if the talks failed, which they have failed now, then there are going to be more attacks. So terrorism is the biggest challenge, and how to deal with the situation in Pakistan. And that has to also deal with the foreign direct investment. Whether you can provide the level playing field or you can address the GSTs or other issues, if the risk is high, you will not find FDI coming into the country. Cathay Pacific airline stopped flying to Karachi since last night or since the attack. We had the Emirates airline plane loaded with passengers, 300 plus, at around 11 p.m. taking off and could not take off, and the army guarded the plane for about 5 hours, and then it left after 2 p.m. So one wonders, you know, the foreign airlines, will they think twice before increasing their frequency to Pakistan, or some will cut off? So if you do not have the foreign banks, which are now very few left in the country, if you do not have the foreign airlines coming into the country, then you will find where the foreign direct investment will come. Will they just manage it through the local people? That's a big question. So I think the topmost priority for the government is to deal with the security. If they have to go with the operation, then they have to go with the operation. In Waziristan or elsewhere, now it's very evident that Uzbeks have declared it, that they have a camp, they have a base in North Waziristan, and it's a big issue. I think I would say that that we had the most corrupt government over the last 5 years, PPP, and we are seeing that the first year of Nawaz Sharif's government has been reasonably good when you compare with what has happened over the last 5 years. There is a tolerance in the leadership of the Nawaz Sharif. We have not seen till date over the last 13 months not a major scandal of corruption in this government, whereas we have seen in the previous government many scandals and with proofs, and these are still being heard in the courts. So one must give credit to this government that that reasonably the cabinet ministers are clean. It's I mean, I have not seen major exemptions yet being given by this government. They have been given in the past, but not much. The budget obviously has come in, and there are some pluses, some minuses. There are some incentives for the textile and other areas, but widely I think the government has over the last 1 year has done reasonably well. The manifesto of the PMLN talks about two major areas. One, the private sector primary engine of economic development, and then the public investment should be made into the infrastructure and energy and other areas. PMLN is more or less living up to this promise, though a bit slow. They are encouraging private sector investment. Prime Minister chairs regularly a meeting of the public and private representative. It's a Pakistan Business Council, and there have been suggestions made in those meetings, and Prime Minister is keen and is implementing. The only issue is that he has a very limited group of ministers around him, and you find not many ministers have access to the Prime Minister. So all the policies are centered within the family. This is the criticism that he's getting. One of the area which worries me and to many that we see these mega state-owned enterprises which are causing huge losses to the extent of about $5 billion a year. And this government promised, and in his first speech before the National Assembly, Prime Minister said that they will make the appointments on those SOEs, the Board of Directors on merit, the Chief Executive on merit, and the Chairman. A commission was constituted under the directive of the Supreme Court, and then somehow or the other that commission is not functioning. And till date about 35 SOEs are without permanent heads. Under the corporate governance rules which SAIP worked with Ministry of Finance and the Securities Exchange Commission of Pakistan, it's the Board of Directors which has to appoint the Chief Executive. And the government can appoint the Board of Directors based on merit. The rules were enacted, and this government had full 1 year actually to implement those rules. And that's where I agree with Dr. Ahmed, that favoritism is there in those appointments. PIA is also mentioned in the manifesto of the PMLN, that they have to turn it around. But 1 year has passed, and there has not been an elected chairman of the board of PIA, Pakistan International Airline. Professional directors are not there. The CEO is not there. Some of these big mega SOEs are causing millions of dollars of losses, and this is something which this government could have controlled it and could have appointed quality people to begin with. The PMLN manifesto also talks about the privatization. I served on the privatization board for 7 years, and some good things happened in the Musharraf's time with regards to the privatization, true privatization, which means that you either sell the shares of 26% or 51% to the strategic investor, or to go and list on the stock exchange with 5 to 10%, and then discover the price, and then they offer the strategic investment. These were some good things happen in the Musharraf's time. But this government, having committed to privatization, is not really on the road of privatization. It's going towards the disinvestment. The first project or first disinvestment was announced yesterday, which is the United Bank Limited, which is already listed, and government is making huge dividends out of its investment. If we were to look at the Malaysian or the Singaporean models, then they keep investing in profitable ventures. So there's no need as such to disinvest in my view, of Habib Bank or United Bank or others where government is making good money and good dividend. It's the entities which are giving losses, you need to fix those and then get rid of those. So this is a big minus for this government. But then there are good chance for this government to work with the private sector in terms of taxations. This budget came in, it has got mixed reactions, but then the tax to GDP ratio went down to 8.5% in the previous government. It's again, I agree with Dr. Ahmed, finding the right data an accurate data. To some, it's 9% now, and the finance minister is talking of taking it to 1% each year, from 10 to 13% by the year 2017. Collection of tax, high targets, and then you revise the targets downward because you're too ambitious and your machinery is corrupt. I can give you a ground reality as to what happens. A small example. We have a restaurant in Karachi which is called, some of you have been there, Wilson, Barbecue Tonight. Barbecue Tonight hosts about 4,000 people at a peak time, and it could be 1,000 a night. Right? GST is 17%. They're the custodian of that money, which you and me, we pay, and they have to deposit that money. One estimate is that only 3% of that which is paid by the customers goes to the coffins. So GST collection is a big question also, whether it goes there into the right pockets or not. So if you just take this Barbecue Tonight example, then we have about 50 restaurants across the sea, on the sea. And these are big restaurants, huge places, at least 10 to 15,000 people eat every night there, full activity. And the price is inclusive of the GST. And you don't get the receipt also of the GST. And I mean, the commissioners of the income tax and their families and others, they go and they eat, and I've seen some of them not taking their wallet out. So this is again a corruption. I won't say that this government needs to fix it, but this has been going on, and this is a big issue with regards to the collection of taxes in the government. And this could be all over the country except in some 5-star hotels where they have to do this. So the collection is, I mean, then you put all these targets and then you revise your budget. So tax machinery is not really that great, and it needs to improve. There are tariff reforms and others which have to be have to find the legal process. Some of the amendments in the government laws which have to be made, and painfully this government wants to do this, but then they do not have the majority in the Senate. So I think some legislative reforms, either the tax or devolution of power with the provinces and others, which are required to be made, and I'm told that this government is waiting till March 2015 when the PMLN will have the majority in the Senate. At the moment, the majority in the Senate is with the PPP government, so they blocked this. Now, regardless of whether they get this amendment through in the Constitution, with regards to the privatization, the PPP government has threatened. Its leader of the opposition says that if you go for selling the PIA and others, I will go on hunger strike. So, a couple of months ago, the privatization minister was not saying privatization, rather he started saying public-private partnership. So got scared of this. So whether they are able to do this, it's going to be a real determination and will and good strategy. But then they have also another leader of opposition, which Mark also mentioned earlier to me, Imran Khan. And Imran Khan, for the sake of criticizing, is criticizing this government a lot. So we have not seen anything coming out positive from Imran Khan. His party's manifesto talks about privatization too. So he should rather go into the parliament and talk about it in the National Assembly and propose the way forward, instead of saying you're doing this wrong, and this is not the way. But he should rather say that, okay, let's go and fix it, and he should support the government. So this is unfortunately is not being good for the PMLN government. That is not getting full support. I must also say that, you know, Nawaz Sharif took a good step going to the house of Imran Khan. Not any of the head of the state will go to the leader of the opposition and go to his house and greets him and meets him, which means that, you know, you are in a position, fine, but at least there has to be a support where there is a positive move, or there is this transparency required. Circular debt, that's a big issue. This government is trying to address the energy issue for last 1 year. I agree that the road from highway is not required, or bulletproof trains are not required, but more importantly, yes, energy is a big issue. Nawaz Sharif, in his various speeches pre-election, said that we will punish the thieves of electricity. We will take them to task, we will make all the collections. But unfortunately, again, buying the votes and going through these local bodies election, they did not force this this policy of collection. So collection of the electricity dues is very poor, and this is a big issue for this government. Even if you pump more into the big projects, if you're not able to collect the right dues, you will not be able to successful. Circular debt is piling up again, and it's a big question to the finance minister, which is going to be raised this week in the National Assembly, that the budget does not give a provision of about $3 billion of circular debt, which has piled up, and how will it be financed? So this is going to be a challenge for the government to deal again with the circular debt issue. GST collection is a big problem. It missed last year the target by 77%. And again this year, one wonders if you fix the targets and if you're not able to collect. One good thing about this government is that they are focusing more on the youth, which is the largest sector of the population. The Prime Minister, in his earlier tenure, had given the yellow cab scheme to the people to go and buy yellow cabs and drive around. In this government, they want to give some incentive to the youths, but the charge of this youth project has been given to the Prime Minister's daughter, and there is a lot of criticism on that, because she is given this huge portfolio, and she's summoning all the secretaries, and the secretaries, federal secretaries, grade 22 officers, being summoned by the Prime Minister's daughter. That does not go well with this government. It talks that it's being done by the family. But then this big incentive for the youth is necessary, because at the end of the day, the biggest challenge besides the terrorism, the energy, is going to be unemployment. and inflation. With this, I conclude my opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Moin, for those comments. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure we'll come back around to many of these topics. Brian, as you share your comments with us, a few sort of issues have been opened up here, sort of in your realm on the democracy and governance issues. We've heard some remarks on the corruption issues. We heard some interesting discussion on problems with political party financing, which harkens back to your NDI days. And so I'm wondering, wondering what you have in mind along those lines. So please.
Certainly. Thanks a lot, Mark, and for the other panelists also for their thoughts on these issues. What I'm going to do, I'll try to hit on some of those questions, but also sort of take a step back, look at this less on the very specific details of particular policies, but more the big picture here, and how I see that the link between reforms and democratic development in the country. So overall, elections, democratic elections, are about holding leaders accountable. And until 2013, Pakistani voters didn't have many opportunities to do that. Previously, there have been many instances of the military stepping in and not allowing voters the opportunity to change course. Based on history, Pakistani civilian governments were really more threatened more by military intervention than they were by rejection in the next election. And that really reduces the responsiveness of civilian government to voter priorities. So in terms of the economic policies of this government, I mean, you can have democratic governments that have a wide range of policies on the left or right in terms of government intervention in the economy. But in terms of democratic development in the country, the thing that I would be looking at specifically is the degree to which the policies that the government is implementing reflect the priorities of the voters that put them there. And if they're able to do this, if this does happen, that reinforces the democratic system. And if they don't do that, then the voters have a chance the next round to throw them out and try the next one. So in '99, Sharif, he was overthrown in part because of the Kargil operation, his confrontation with the military. The coup, however, was justified in terms by the military in terms of economic mismanagement and corruption. Although many citizens were clearly unhappy with the direction the country was going, they didn't have an alternative they didn't have an opportunity to vote in an alternative. So let's look at what the sort of state of play was right before the last election. A March 2013 poll said that 70% of the public felt that their economic situation had gotten worse in the past year. 16% said same, 14% better. So clearly, broad disenchantment with the economic direction of the country. And this had been constant for the years, for the several years leading up to the election. What were the top problems that people said were facing Pakistan? Well, 23% top problem, inflation, 20% electricity, 70% terrorism, 16% unemployment. So in addition to extremism, broadly, a huge sort of unhappiness with the economic state of the country. As we said here, in the U.S. in past elections, it's the economy, stupid, and that was the situation in Pakistan, certainly. So what have been the priorities of the Sharif government? At least what have they said is their priorities? Well, they say it's the 4 E's: energy, economy, extremism, education. And also these align with USAID priorities. In terms of the economics elements of this, not in terms of the extremism, let's look at the economic side of things and the degree to which, and one way to look at that is the degree to which the government is meeting IMF targets. And you can look at this a variety of ways, but I think many people would say that there has been progress. You have improvements in state bank reserves, expansion of GDP, the growth that looks like 4% in the next fiscal year, meeting targets for the Benazir Income Support Program cash transfers. But I mean, the big challenge has been mentioned before is expanding the tax base, and the big issue, of course, or one of the big issues, is exemptions, and particularly the exemptions, or what Mr. Ahmad was referring to in terms of reducing exemptions for political opponents, or for political keeping exemptions for your allies and reducing them for opponents. So that's a bad sign. But also, so you look at some of the other those stats: reduction in the deficit, inflation down to single digits, and then the big question of energy. Reducing subsidies, increasing tariffs. Now the challenge with energy is many vested interests remain there, and it's estimated that the energy problems reduce growth by 1 to 2 percentage points. So this is a huge problem. But there've also been some increases in revenue, at least short term. Let's say Eurobond offerings that brought in up to $2 billion, 3G, 4G auctions. But this is short term and is borrowing in terms of the Eurobonds. So, what conclusions can we draw from this? So in some ways, the government, the Sharif government, recognizes what put them in power is unhappiness with the economic situation, and to a certain degree, they are trying to address that. So in terms of, like, for example, on energy, though, the solutions to this are much longer term than the sort of relief that's needed is going to take many years, and that's going to be a challenge for them politically on the energy issue. In a number of ways, you can say the Pakistani government is being responsive to the voters to put it in place. There's a recognition, I think, that it has to perform if it wants to remain in power, and that's a good model. For too long, your ability to stay in power was based on things like patronage. You looking at the exit polling from this last election. Gallup had exit polling. Gallup Pakistan had exit polling. Why? Essentially, the question was, why did you elect choose the party that you did? 19% said party loyalty. 26% basically development seekers, people that were seeking development projects in their local area. 12% patronage, and 16% based on legislation, and there are a number of other factors also. But you look at this compared to previous elections: 97, 39% patronage, and 2008, 17% patronage, with people telling pollsters, hey, this is what I expect from the people that I elect. So you see, I mean, I think that's a good sign, at least, that you see at least people are admitting a lower expectation of direct patronage. What do people say? You know, do people say that is your vote going to be helpful in improving the condition of the country? In 1990, 73% said that yes, they felt their vote. That's increased. In 2013, 87% said that they felt that their vote was going to improve the condition of the country. Looking at what the public perception is now of the Sharif government, and the degree to which it's been able to address these economic issues. You still have a sort of general positive sense, when the public is asked, has the Sharif government, been able to address many of the problems? But then you get into specifics, and you get into specific questions on the economy, foreign policy, inflation, and it's negative, and so that would be a real concern for them. So the challenge really is, I think, that the honeymoon is over, and this government is going to have to show that they can really perform, that they can respond to citizen needs, and on energy, for example, that's going to take quite some time. So I mean, those are a few thoughts on looking at the economic situation. One of the questions that was posed was, what about the financing of political parties? And that's a real issue. And I think that for too long parties have been essentially beholden to large scale either landholders or business interests, and you see policies then that benefit those. The question is that changing? And there may be a sort of very gradual change in that, but still those interests hold a lot of power in the political system. One of the other questions that we were asked to look at was the sort of implications of the Indian elections. And that's an interesting thing related to the Civ-Mil relation. So historically, you've had Pakistan's foreign policy, in particular policy towards India, was heavily influenced by the military. And the civilian government has been quite interested in increasing trade with India. And Modi, elected in India, has a significant majority and could provide the political backing he needs if he chooses a path of economic engagement with Pakistan. And historically, actually, the BJP has been open to engagement with Pakistan. So both Sharif and Modi are considered pro-business, pro-trade leaders. The question really is, will and all the other thing is Sharif and attend Modi's swearing-in ceremony. So the question is here, will economic pragmatism win out for Modi and Sharif, and what implication does that have for the Civ-Mil dynamic in Pakistan? And that still remains to be seen, I think. We're just at the very beginning there. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer their questions as we continue.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very interesting remarks. Particularly, I like your formulation here of the difference between the sort of general feeling that the government is doing better and the sort of the troubles that you see when you start asking people about specifics of performance. Also, I think you've raised some really challenging notions about the issue of accountability and those difficult dynamics of accountability towards the population that's elected this government to accomplish certain things on the economic front, versus accountability to the IMF over some of the macro issues that that need to be addressed in order to keep those funds flowing in. So I think we'll probably have a chance to talk about that a little bit more. And I think that actually leads very well to Espy's thoughts on how the foreign business community, the international investment community, is sort of seeing things with respect to performance promises versus reality on the ground.
Okay, so what I thought is I kind of provide a twist. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel and look at this issue. I thought I would provide my remarks as a reflection of my observations and my experience in dealing with the Pakistani private sector as well as the foreign investment community. So pretty much I'll be looking at the private sector and my observations on how they see the initial steps of the government to develop economic reform, enhance the business environment, and at the same time, the role the private sector could play in developing public policy and working with the government on these issues. Going last, I feel that a lot of the issues that I wanted to address or at least mention have been covered, but again, I'm kind of presenting them from the view of a private sector, someone who has experience in the private sector. So, as I said, I've had the privilege of working closely with both private sectors, and in a recent visit to Pakistan, I perceived a great sense of optimism, as has been said before, among the members of the local business community as well as the foreign investors. The sentiment expressed by the private sector is that the government, or at least was at that moment, and that was March, was open to business on a path to reform and working to address the country's energy crisis. There was also a feeling that at the highest level, there was a true commitment to tackle the challenges, spur growth, and foster investment, as well as improve the competitiveness of the country's companies, of the companies operating in the country. So the government has stepped up its efforts, as has been said before, on economic reform. We realized, the private sector realized the short-term capacity constraints and that the government must make tough decisions. However, many in the business community feel that, express concern on the pace of the economic reform and the implementation of these reforms. Some of the initial achievements of the government have been mentioned, mainly those prompted by commitments they made to the IMF. But one thing that I heard is that the business community views that the key officials that have been appointed with responsibility over the economic reform have private sector experience and understand our issues and have an idea of the things that need to be done in order to move forward with reforms. That kind of at the top. But it's been said already. GDP is expected to grow perhaps at 4.1% compared to last year 3.7%. Very small, but a considerable improvement for Pakistan, given their situation. The government's effort to increase the foreign exchange reserves and strengthen the rupee was also a great accomplishment. The government's Eurobond offering and the auction of the 3G and 4G licenses has helped boost the country's cash reserves. They had 2 successful reviews of the IMF, and their recent review last May was in the press release. The IMF said they were encouraged by the overall progress in pushing ahead with policies. So again, a general view. When you go down to the issues, you also find all kinds of comments. The IMF board will be actually reviewing the report of that session, and we will hear later in the month what the situation is. Energy, as has been said, there is a focus on a practical approach on energy You may have heard about several infrastructure and development projects. Some of them are innovative, increasing generation capacity, promoting a mix of projects in coal, solar, hydro, and biomass. Um, but the major challenges for the private sector is the law and order situation, personal security, and travel issues, as we know for the incidents in the last week. Um, the government of Pakistan appears to understand that greater stability is needed to attract foreign direct investment. However, this remains one of the most difficult tasks. If you look at what the foreign chamber associations are saying in Pakistan, law and order situation and energy crisis are at the top. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit about the energy crisis. We all know that they have a huge need. Demand continues to grow, and therefore they will need massive investment in this sector. In the recent budget, the government is trying to respond to IMF requirements by removing power subsidies. However, this could have an inflationary impact, and we are watching inflation closely as well. Growing the economy remains the challenge for the Pakistani government. Job creation is a key government objective, as they need, according to most estimates, to at least to grow at 7% to absorb the incoming workforce. The government is also trying to broaden the tax base and have a goal of adding, in meetings that I was present, 100,000 new tax payers to each year. Only 0.5% of the total population paid taxes last year, so they're going little by little, hoping to increase. We know that a reasonable tax structure and transparent customs and tax procedures with proper enforcement across the board can in turn provide the best results in enhancing government revenue and supporting the legal and compliant industry, the private sector. The new finance bill appears business-friendly, mixed reviews, some gains, some losses here and there. It's too early really to tell. People are still going through the finance bill. However, the biggest issue regarding this is implementation of tax policy, as has been said before. That's, it's good to have a plan, but also implementation. And broadening the tax base, it's important, and therefore effective enforcement, accountability, and good governance are equally important. The government must also ensure that the tax policy entices the non-taxpayers, the informal economy, to become part of the tax net. We heard corporate tax has been reduced by 1%, 34 to 33%. Nothing for the banking sector, but for Pakistan to remain attractive and competitive, at least in the region, the corporate rate should be at least 30. That's the general feeling in the private sector, foreign private sector. As they seek to, the government seeks to enhance the business environment and move on with these policies, there are some things that they need to work on. It's been said before, privatization. I would say, I've mentioned it at the top. They have pledged that it will be transparent, fast-track time, and will involve outreach to stakeholders. And I guess this is where it becomes the biggest challenge, is that there is a strong opposition across Pakistan to privatization. There are concerns of unemployment and shifting workforces, and so privatization will remain a challenge. They need to expedite it, reduce, and at least start by working on reducing the huge losses that they are incurring, and more importantly, appointing the independent and professional boards that must be appointed in all these state-owned enterprises. One issue that I want to highlight that also is key for foreign investors is IPR, intellectual property rights. Pakistan is on USTR's priority watch list in 2014. There are concerns on counterfeiting, lack of protection of trademarks, patents, and copyrights. Foreign investors value strong intellectual property rights as a driver of innovation and creativity for both domestic and foreign right holders. The Intellectual Property Organization of Pakistan, it's working to set up tribunals with specialized judges, which remains a challenge given the lack of IPR legal capability in the country. Capacity building is their biggest challenge. By strengthening implementation of the IPR laws as well as IPR enforcement institutions, such as the IPO, it will help Pakistan promote an innovative society that can attract foreign investment. Equally important is regional trade. As been said before, Pakistan wants to extend the trade corridor from China to Central Asia and normalize trade with India. The dialogue with India on most favored nation, also known as non-discriminatory market access or NDMA, is very encouraging to the private sector. We haven't studied it, deeply, but we feel that it opens a lot of opportunities. There is a lot of regional trade in between, bilateral trade between a lot of the South Asian nations. India being the largest economy provides immense opportunities, not just to Pakistan, but other countries in the region. In closing, I would say that the private sector and, more importantly, the business associations can play an important role in strengthening democracy in Pakistan. The private sector has consistently urged the development of long-term policies and encouraged outreach to business and industry on ongoing consultations. As a positive development in the last year, we have seen increasingly a more constructive role of the private sector organizations, not just from the organizations themselves reaching out to the government, but the government proactively reaching out to the organizations. That's what I seem to see as a change and actually something very positive. We could definitely play a more significant and constructive role and help strengthen the institutions that can have impact on Pakistan's economy and Pakistan's economic and social development. As the government of Pakistan seeks to enhance trade and development, create investment opportunities and job creation, the private sector will continue to support and foster public-private sector dialogue. And as I said, the focus should be on strengthening this private sector associations and their role so that they're not political organizations, but actually organizations that can promote democratic, moving forward on strengthening democracy. And thank you again for the opportunity. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Espy, and thank you for pointing out that important link between democratic development and the role of chambers and associations, which is something that we work on very much at SIPE. I think it's interesting to highlight the role that the business community is playing, both in terms of pushing for policy change and also in terms of some of these accountability issues that came up in the discussion today. And I would just very briefly mention that for the last year or so, SIPE has been working with a think tank in Islamabad called PRIME on a scorecard kind of approach to monitoring implementation of the very specific economic policy promises that were in the PMLN electoral platform. And this think tank has put out a couple of quarterly reports to date, and the next one will be sometime this summer, I think July. Yeah, so I think Espy is spot on in terms of highlighting that link that the private sector and private sector oriented think tanks and civil society organizations are playing in the democratic development. I think another key point that you raised, Espy, really has to do with implementation. I think that's something that we actually heard across the board. Sort of an overarching theme that I hear from all four of your remarks is this difference between what's been promised and what's been set at a very high level, both by the Prime Minister and very high-level ministers, and some of the difficulties in terms of implementation. SB, you pointed specifically to enforcement of IPR, or you talked about implementation of tax policies. So, I think we're focused a lot at SIPE on the advocacy side, but from a public administration point of view, sort of where the rubber meets the road, I think there's a lot of challenges that need to be confronted. Also, that I think comes across in the remarks that all of you made this morning. So, I think without further ado, I think rather than sort of asking you a question, maybe we'll just open it up right away to the audience, and we'll just sort of take it from there. Please. And if you could, we all know Mr. Nawaz, but the rest of you, if you could just please bear in mind an introduction of name and affiliation would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Excellent presentations, and I just have two quick questions. I guess these would be aimed both at Ehtisham and Moin, but Brian and SB can pitch in on them. One is, it's often said about Pakistan that whatever economic growth and development has occurred is not because of government, but in spite of government. So it'd be useful to get a little snapshot of the size and role of the informal sector and the underground economy, particularly in light of Ehtisham's comments about the fact that the fiscal net hasn't really expanded very effectively or efficiently. And then related to that, there was some talk before the finance bill about the possibility of real estate taxation, and following the model used in India, where at the time of a sale of real estate property, when it is actually registered, the authorities, the government had the right to purchase the same property at a 20% premium over the recorded price. Isn't there, first of all, was this actually finally put in the finance bill? Or aren't there such surrogate means available to capture people into the tax net, so that rather than a full frontal assault on income tax, which people are avoiding, real estate being such a huge part of the investment in Pakistan, this may be one way of doing it, and what's been the experience elsewhere that could be applied to Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you. Both. There's now quite a lot of evidence on how to handle informality. If you look at the work being done in Mexico over the last couple of years, the focus has been on essentially using information as a way of stopping people from cheating. Informality is not just the chap with the sort of wheelbarrow at the street corner. Of course, there are many of those too. But it's cheating by firms, and firms that actually hide labor to hide profits and output, and of course that leads to inefficient outcomes. So again, taking a leaf out of the Chinese book, what the Mexicans focused on in their big reform last December was to fix the information generation of the value-added tax. That's the Mexican reform. If you have the full information on the chain, and here it doesn't actually matter whether you are able to get the restaurants or not, but of course it's helpful. But what you're really interested in is the inter-industry flows. You want that full information, and also you want to give benefits to the inter-industry flows to enable them to compete. And that's the whole sense in which creating a level playing field is essential. That's what the Mexicans have done, is focus on creating a level playing field and at the same time eliminating, all sorts of special provisions for this sector or that region or that individual. The Mexican tax system and the Pakistani tax system look very, very similar, with the GST or the VAT in Mexico generating around less than 3% of GDP. China, similar rate, 16%, generates 9% of GDP. And how do they do that? Well, they follow the production chain. And when we were helping the Chinese in the early 90s to introduce the value-added tax, they said that, we're going to monitor every invoice. And the IMF said it can't be done. They said, no, watch us. And they did. Really, that's the key. And indeed, if you are going to be wishing that the personal income tax is going to generate a lot of revenues, you may have to wait a very, very long time. So if you're waiting for another 4 or 5% of GDP, really there are not that many options. The property tax issue is extremely interesting, but again, the problem goes back to the Constitution. It works best if you link property taxes to service delivery, and that works best at the local level. Here, the property tax doesn't belong to local government, it belongs to provinces. Provinces are too big to make the linkage between effective service delivery and the taxes that people pay. If you're living in Washington, D.C., you throw out the mayor if he doesn't use your property tax to improve service delivery. You can't do that in Pakistan. It's just at the wrong level. So it immediately comes back to an assignment issue. And really what Pakistan needs, and indeed this is a serious recommendation for the government as it's going into the next NFC, is to reconsider, perhaps with the opposition, the current set of revenue assignments. Much in the same way as the Indians have been doing over the last 5 or 10 years. They realize that if you are to compete with the Chinese, or you're to compete with the Thais or the Vietnamese, you have to stop shooting yourself in the foot by introducing this cascading effect which is generated by exemptions. And of course, with the cascading effect of exemptions, the self-enforcing elements of the tax system also disappear. So not only do you not get revenues, you create opportunities for the taxman to do deals. In a sense, a whole system that then becomes deals at the political level, deals being done by the taxman, how much money actually gets into the pockets of the treasury. And as Muin was saying, not very much. But then, you can indeed devise a system where there is no tax collector. You make your payment in the bank. You don't have to give it to the guy who comes with the bag to collect the money every night. So, there are modern mechanisms to set up a tax administration system. And indeed, if you recall, after Shahid Hussain was asked by Musharraf to come and redesign the tax system, and he did a good job, sort of looking at the best practices in Latin America. The World Bank gave $150 million to Pakistan to modernize tax administration. This is way back in 2001. When I started looking at it in 2008, initially at Dar's request, but then, the PPV government asked me to stay on and take a look. They hadn't even started. And this was already the end of the program. $150 million. So, now the World Bank's going to give them $300 million to do what? Exactly the same thing? So the question really eventually boils down to political will. Is there the political will? And are they, is the government responsive? Or are they still stuck in the mindset of, coming back to my opening thoughts, really we must essentially refurbish our war chest for the next election. Or, you may have an apartment or two in Park Lane to finance, or a chateau in France or something like that, but these things happen. So, you have to get your priorities right. So, the fact that the IMF, and coming back to points being made by Esperanza, has given them a clean bill of health on the back of borrowed money, on the back of very drastic reductions in basic services. Now, that's not the way you do long-term development. On the back of some dubious numbers, our former IMF colleague who was also Nawaz Sharif's central bank governor, Dr. Yaqub, has been writing very, very, very interesting articles, and I think spot on, that the numbers actually are misleading. Where are all the liabilities being hidden? You know, if you're only looking at a cash deficit, it's very easy to get to the numbers. If you park the deficits in state-owned enterprises, that's not part of your bottom line, and you're not counting arrears being built up, heck, you can get any deficit number you want. So, you know, and if you're doing this on the back of borrowing billions of dollars at commercial rates, remember, this is not the IMF, you're going to need Paris Club rescheduling in a very short period of time. It's okay today, but if you're going to use that, it's a question of how you use that breathing space. And what I see so far is not much thought has been given to how to generate growth. If you're going to give away the money in handouts to obviously some poor people, fine. I mean, some of that is needed, but it's not going to generate growth. What you need for growth and sustainable growth, look at the Chinese model. They put the money in production hubs, and they created a level playing field. We are not doing that. We are not fixing our cities. We're not fixing our hubs. We're not fixing our infrastructure. So even if you were to get rid of the problems with terrorism, I mean, they're not going to get growth. And if you have a tax system that discriminates against your exports, you're not going to be able to compete with India as you open up. So, I mean, a lot of these industries are going to go under when you start opening tariffs with India, let alone the Chinese. The Indians can't compete with the Chinese. You open up the trade with the Chinese and, you know, become the next autonomous republic.
Size of the informal economy, different versions, 50%, two-thirds, 75%. But what this government has done actually is given incentive to declare your national tax number for a reduced withholding tax. And this is an incentive, not only in real estate, but also in mobile phones, that you go for a mobile phone and you go, and if you have an NTN tax, then that tax, withholding tax, is actually adjustable. So this is an incentive which is being given, not outright, major shift in the way that they need to handle this, but it's just a minor way of very short-sighted approach, actually, no vision. So these are, piecemeal approaches that you find that even in dealing with the informal economy. I mean, again, you have large number of traders who obviously are voters and vote banks of the PML and others. So when you went to the fixed tax regime, people were happy. When you wanted to go for the adjustable, people were unhappy. But there has to be a political will to deal with the situation. But I mean, these are small items, whether these are going to really make a big difference, but one needs to see that the overall tax administration and the collection machinery needs to be there. But there is one tax which they also levied recently on the mutual fund industry, because they thought that there was arbitrage taking place where the banks were investing through the mutual fund industry. Whereas, there are large number of pensioners who are investing into the mutual fund. So, again, the budget needs to be discussed, and I think the budget discussions will kick off by Asad Omar. So there are a good number of people, from the opposition side, which needs to really make their presence felt, and they have to really, come up with their arguments and solutions. And again, the PMLN is not in majority in the Senate, so they need to really make the point and guide the government and go through the process, which I hope should really make a difference.
We have a question in the back.
Elaine Sorrell, Foreign Aid Through Education and Economic Development. I'm wondering, with the rapidly expanding growth of the youth in Pakistan, with the failed state of education and training for the youth, where do you see the private sector being able to even come in to make investment into the economy? What role could the private sector play to try to tap into this failed state, which is presently on the course for destabilizing the whole state of Pakistan into its state of catastrophe? Thank you.
Who would like to,
Let me just say, you're absolutely right. It's all about education. It's education, education, education. It's educating these poor people who are coming onto the workforce, not giving them another 10 rupees or 100 rupees. To do what? So if you're able to educate them and do what China has done and do what Korea has done or do what Chile is now coming around to doing, recognizing that you have to educate if you're going to compete. You want to attract foreign investment, you have to have an educated workforce. So it's all about education, and they're cutting the money for education. So to me, this is very short. This is the short-sighted aspect of public policy, and in a sense, the IMF is complicit in it, because how do you get your deficit targets is by withholding money from the provinces. So they're the ones who are doing the basic education, and you get them to run surpluses because you want to meet a deficit target. Well, I mean, very short-sighted. You're not going to get that education. So, there will be some private sector education, and clearly the private sector is doing quite a lot in meeting the gap, but that's going to exclude the vast majority of the people who you're worried about.
But where could possibly corporate involvement become, public-private partnering for an effort? Because it's obviously not happening on the federal level. It has never happened on the federal level at all. There's no history of it. There's talk, but there's no history of actual action.
Yeah, I mean, you will need to provide effective public education. So they seem to have given up on the public education, and which means essentially that you're going to get exclusion. And you're going to get exclusion of the youth who will not be properly trained and will not be qualified to get proper jobs. I mean, the public-private partnerships in education only take you so far. And you end up, even with public-private partnerships, in running up a public bill. If you're trying to kick the can down the road, well, public-private partnerships are very good at that. But you still somebody has to pick up the bill. If you just look at Europe, in Southern Europe, the PPPs are a big problem. There is a P. The first P is public. So, I mean, if you don't have the resources and you're not putting in the money and you're not really getting your act together, look at what Bachelet is doing. With the private sector economy in Chile doing very well on macro terms in growth, but not providing enough jobs, not providing enough education. So the priority in Chile is to take the tax GDP ratio from 20 to 23% of GDP to be able to provide an additional 3% of public education, because the vouchers did not provide the solution. So really, you're looking for a tax envelope of 23%, and in order to meet the Millennium Development Goals, you need an envelope of around 18% of GDP. There's no way a government in Pakistan with a 9% tax envelope is going to do more than providing for interest payments and defense. Nothing. There's zero for education.
So I agree with Etisham in the fact that the government must step up its efforts on education, especially public education. I would say from the foreign investment community that through their corporate social responsibility, what I see is they have a strong focus on education and the youth. That's a strong focus. Also on training for the youth. NGOs, I come across a lot of NGOs working on education. I've also heard that there's not a lot of schools. There are plenty of schools, even in the Gilgit area, different areas that you never think of. It's actually getting the teachers and the resources to educate. Never mind changing social ideas about the role of women, or who should be going to school. But in sense, the gap that the government is not providing is covered somewhat, but not enough, and definitely the government must step up its efforts.
I think the private sector investment, obviously, for the youth needs to be in, for example, call centers. Pakistan has got quite a few call centers at the moment, but we do have good quality graduates which are coming in, and they're all looking for opportunities abroad because the private sector has not grown. But with this government, if there are more incentives, I'm pretty sure that the private sector, as this government is projecting, if they went on and they invested in some areas where the youth can be employed, and again the Prime Minister's youth program is also there to attract, to provide some access to finance to the youth, so they can do their own businesses. There is we have not seen yet the delivery of the manifesto of the PMLN government with regards to the youth, but the private sector certainly needs to come forward and invest.
I'm trying to concatenate. Pardon me?
Your name?
I'm Ann Sweetser. I'm a consultant. I worked with the ADB in Islamabad, and I did anthropological research in the country earlier. I'm trying to put together 2 or 3 ideas, so let me present those and then ask if the juncture of them makes any sense. It seems to me that, taking up from your point, Etisham, that you only can have a functional tax on real estate locally. Accountability has to be local. And if you're going to have democracy, you're talking about accountability for service delivery and financial systems. Governments in Pakistan have, there were the basic democracies of Ayub and Zia's local government and devolution under Musharraf and so on. All of these have sort of come and gone. Throughout, there's been this local civil service that has not been merit-based. You know that you're the nephew of the right person, you can get in even if you're illiterate and so on. So it seems to me that really building democracy in the country should include, and not necessarily schooling, but education in the sense of experiential development of how to deal with financial decisions locally in say, districts or TESOL level or something like that. And no matter what is done at the federal level, I mean, policies on taxation, everything can be changed, but nothing actually changed about the understanding of democracy farther down. So I'm wondering if anything is happening at the more local level in this juncture of economics and real comprehension of democracy and accountability.
Sure. I mean, this has been one of the real challenges, I think. At the local level and local elections at the local level, and you really haven't seen this yet. And you had local elections in Baluchistan. The first was last year. A lot of complaints about that and how that went, and everyone's dragging their feet on having local elections in the other provinces. So I think this is the real challenge, and where the rubber meets the road in terms of democratic development. So yeah, I think certainly this is and you just don't see progress so far.
To some extent, Musharraf started down the right route, but for the wrong reasons. What he was doing was going down to the local government level without deciding what they're going to do, without deciding what their own sources of finances are. And it was a way of bypassing the political parties at the provinces. So all of what you're seeing now is a reaction. Some of these ostensibly good measures for decentralization to the local level, which I agree has to be where the democracy really comes alive. If you're talking about a democratic process, that's where the rubber hits the road, as you're saying. But in order to do that, you have to do pretty much what the Indians have done. The Indians brought in a constitutional amendment to give rights to the panchayats and the municipalities, constitutional right. They have not done enough on both the revenue side, because they still have problems with the Government of India Act mentality from you have some security, garbage is collected, your children get schooling. So those are the things you demand from people who you're paying the tax to. If you're paying the tax to someone, sitting thousands of miles away, I mean, there's no linkage with the democratic process. So in a sense, there is a fundamental flaw, coming back again to the constitutional issues. It's the legacy of a colonial structure which still exists today. That's the Pakistan Constitution. If you look at the Pakistan Constitution, look at the Government of India Act 1935, the only thing that's changed is the dropping of the concurrent list on spending. The revenues still remain.
I think our hosts inform us that we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So let's take those 2 questions and then folks can respond to that. One here and one in the back. Yeah, and sorry for that. And please feel free to try to catch any of the speakers afterwards if you didn't get a chance to ask your question. So let's take maybe one in the back first and then take whichever.
Hi, I'm Farah Heather. I have a question. I know we've talked more about the macro level with private enterprise and corporations.
You speak up a little bit.
But what I was wondering is, what can we do at the individual level, besides, of course, paying taxes and whatnot for those of us who are there? But what about those of us who are here who want to encourage the process, whether it's to get involved through corporations or through organizations such as this one? Where can we as individuals to get involved and maybe encourage or nudge the process here, if possible?
My name is Uzair Yunus. I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School focusing on monetary policy issues. So I think for taxation, the system in Pakistan, coming from a business family in Karachi, is representation without taxation. And that's the status quo, and that's what everyone believes in. So if parliamentarians don't pay taxes or are seen not to pay taxes, it's not going to trickle down, and people on the normal level of society won't pay their taxes. My question really is around the State Bank of Pakistan and the erosion of its autonomy. We've seen since the People's Party government came to power this sort of game of musical chairs being played, and the last governor resigned in January. And what have been the effects of the new government on the autonomy of the State Bank of Pakistan? There were reports that they were told to toe the line of the finance minister, and if they didn't, then they had to leave. And what's been going on that side? Thank you.
Again, sorry, I know a little bit about the State Bank. You can have there is enough already in the legislation to have an autonomous central bank. Already, it was done in the late 90s. It was done when Yaqub was there. But the trouble is that in order to make it work, you need a governor who's capable of standing up. You can put in as many pieces of legislation as you want. And you can bring in another act to make an independent central bank. You put your own governor in place, and that's the end of it. So, I mean, that's been, unfortunately, the problem. And you're absolutely right that, when people see people in parliament, the ministers, the president, the prime minister not paying taxes, well, why should anybody else pay taxes? There was a very nice piece a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, done by this, Chima, showing, that found the information on who pays what in terms of income tax, and they don't pay any tax. So we know that. But then how do you get them to actually do it? You need to know what their assets are, so you need a balance sheet, and you need changes in the balance sheet. So it's a combination of both. What do you do for the individual levels is an excellent question. You know, we're all trying to do what we can to help, and, you know, some of us write and think, and hopefully some of it gets through. Very likely not, but I mean, you're young and energetic, and you can do more than, you know, old people like me. So, you know, I'd like to learn from you what you think is possible. At least in my case, you know, end of my career, it's not much that I can do other than write.
I agree that it's the personality which matters. We've seen Dr. Ishrat Hussain, one of the finest governor of a state bank. The state bank constitution allowed it, he worked it. And there's a board of director, fully autonomous, gives backing to the governor. Shamshad Akhtar, another governor. So when you, obviously, you know, you need the right person who can take up and stand up. We have not seen that, unfortunately, in Yasin Anwar, though he was he came up to the expectation a bit late. But then, you know, party-driven, political-driven, current governor has not yet made his face to the public too much. We have to see whether he stands up in that. But the autonomy is given within the Constitution. There is no further legal amendment required in the state bank constitution or state bank bylaws.
It's in the Constitution.
It's given in the Constitution. So, I mean, the guy needs to stand up without any political interference or scare or put his job on stake or no. He has to do it. And if 2 or 3 people do this job, and if they keep going, then there is going to be, you know, stability. We have seen that in other places. But more importantly, not only the state bank, you are also talking of this Securities Exchange Commission of Pakistan at the moment. There is
no Khalid Mirza.
There used to be Khalid Mirza, right? There isn't anyone. Now at the moment you have this gentleman Tahir Mahmood. He is there for 1 year, temporary. They haven't appointed the Competition Commission. Another. So these are big regulatory bodies, you know, which needs to have competent people to drive. I think Muhammad Ali, the former chief, was a good guy, you know. It's another issue that some people thought that he has the backing of the brokers, but he did some quality work. So government really needs to get these people and appoint the quality people. The SCCP and other laws are there, and you need the personality. I agree. You need to. I would rather say that you need to write also. I mean, we go on the social media with 1 or 2 lines and tweet and everything, but there is hardly material in the print media which the rulers generally read rather than go on the social media. That someone else is managing the tweets and all those things. But at least you need to contribute more effectively and write.
Well, I think that unless there's Espy or Brian any further comments that you want to share, I think that unfortunately we're out of time. But I think this has been a very fruitful discussion. So I'd like to please ask you to join me in thanking all of the panelists. I think that you know, we've heard a lot this morning about the notions of accountability for promises and the notions of sort of the downward flow of a lot of good intentions and very bold promises at the top level, and how those are actually transmitted to the day-to-day ground level realities at the provincial level and particularly at the local level. And I think it's rather fitting that we end with this very encouraging notion that really to a great extent the country's future is in the hands of the young people who need to be the ones who demand accountability and you know, engage not just through paying their taxes and voting, but also through civil society organizations, through writing, through speaking, through building these kind of networks at the citizen level that are going to make sure that a lot of the very positive the macro trend lines and the very bold promises actually come to fruition for the daily lives of average Pakistani citizens. So I think we've heard a lot of challenges this morning, but it's actually it's rather fitting, I think, that we end on this optimistic note. So thank you all very much for joining us in this sort of bird's eye view of 1 year of the PMLN's term in office, and I think the panel has done a great job of laying out a number of issues that we'll all be looking and tracking very closely in the coming months. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
What was